Huck, appreciate you hopping on today, brother, and really excited to dive into the referee industry and what you're building. And so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, of course. Super nice meeting you.
Give us some of the background. I know there won't be a terrible ton. We're both younger guys, so there's only so much, which is usually a good thing. But give us how you got here, some inspiration behind the idea, and then we'll dive into it deeper.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously I'm 23. I'm almost 24 years old. So of course, yeah, I picture myself as a bit of an industry expert at this point, but I don't have, the 25, 30 years of experience in the industry. Ultimately, really, this company stemmed based on my own experience as a kid and starting to get into the referee industry. I grew up here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I grew up a couple blocks down the road from my co-founder and CTO. We've been friends our whole lives. We played hockey together growing up. As you can imagine, growing up in Minnesota, I was obsessed with hockey as a kid. Couldn't wait to get to my next practice, game, tournament, whatever it might have been. Ultimately, I started experiencing stuff in the referee industry when I was a freshman in high school. I started reffing hockey games and realized there's a lot of problems in the industry. It's a contractor-based industry, except I wasn't actually able to choose the time or location of any of the games I worked. So I was getting plugged onto games 45 minutes away when I would see that there's one available 5 minutes away. I was getting paid with a check in the mail at the end of the month. For scrimmage games, I'd get a check in the mail at the end of the season. So I was literally using a spreadsheet to try and add up what I was making over the course of the year. And then, at that point, it was kind of just a side hustle, trying to make a little bit of money on the side. I was playing hockey year round, so I didn't really have as much free time for a more structured job opportunity. So for me, it was a great fit, but ultimately I kind of saw a lot of the problems. And then I started playing. I did a year of junior hockey where I actually moved out to the Boston area. I ended up getting traded around, so I ended up in New Jersey at one point, back to Boston. But at that point, it kind of took the love out of the hockey part for me. I was getting traded around, became a commodity. Was honestly really just feeling intellectually stunted too. And at that point, I was realizing wait, a lot of the problems I was seeing in the referee space are also prevalent halfway across the country here on the East Coast. And at that point, again, I was kind of falling out of love with the hockey part. Figured it was time to hang up the skates and go get my education. At that point, I'd only applied to the University of Colorado since I wanted a safety school just in case I got injured or something like that. My mom also lives in Colorado, so I get in-state tuition there as well as Minnesota. So at that point, kind of burnt out. I was like, all right, let's do it. Went out to Colorado, got my degree there in business and communications, and really started this company during my junior year. At the beginning of my junior year, at the end of my sophomore year, I kind of had an epiphany where it was seeing a lot of my friends get really good internships at the Goldman Sachs or the Deloittes of the world. And at that point, I knew that was probably not going to make me happy, or at least make me feel fulfilled. I did grow up in a very entrepreneurial background. My dad is a serial entrepreneur. My dad actually didn't even let me say the word job growing up. He called it the J word, said we make those, we don't get them. So at that point, started the business. I approached my partner, who has a background in computer science, which I do not have any of. So really, my partner and I, we're very different in a lot of our personality traits, but we really complement each other in a lot of ways too. So that's kind of the story on the background and just the inception of the company. And then we can go from there and other questions too.
Yeah, our backgrounds are pretty similar. You have me laughing just from the parent perspective, from the Boston, you just basketball, not hockey. And then, so give us a little bit rundown on the platform, what you've built, and obviously, I think there was a fundraising
Yep.
part at some point recently. Give us sort of the inception of the company and
Sure.
then the idea and how it's evolved.
Yeah, so I started the company at the beginning of my junior year, as I mentioned. We're about 3 years in the business now, a little under 3 years. Really, the idea for this stemmed from watching other gig economy marketplaces and contractor-based industries shift towards that style of business. And ultimately, the idea was let's build Uber for youth sports referees. A lot of people, the way the referee industry works is not exactly intuitive to everyone. So let's pick any youth sports team, for example. I'm in Minnesota, so I'll use an example from Minnesota, but Edina or Wayzata or Minnetonka are all suburbs of Minneapolis. Most of these suburb sports teams, let's say Edina hockey, for example, 95% of these youth organizations actually contract out the referee work to someone we call a referee assigner. So everyone knows Edina hockey needs referees. Referees work their games. most people don't know that intermediary actually exists. So 95% of youth sports organizations will send a schedule and a chunk of money to a local assigner who's then in charge of finding, scheduling, managing, and paying the referees that ultimately work their games. So the way I would picture it is like these assigners, there's 50 to 70,000 of these people across the United States. And ultimately, really what they are is kind of like the taxi companies before Uber came into play. Now, ultimately, our goal at the beginning of this was really to disintermediate that middleman and just become a marketplace where organizations can post games and refs in the area can pick them up based on their qualifications, time, location, date, and compensation that works for them. Where we've come to now is that really we've built a software that has 3 users. So our software incorporates all 3 of these users: the organization for an accounting perspective and payments, the assigner for a management perspective, and the referees for kind of freedom of choice and allowing them to actually pick up games and work them. So right now, and actually our initial product kind of cut that middleman out from the beginning. And what we realized is it's a very different industry than the taxi industry, where ultimately the sports organizations want nothing to do with the actual scheduling of referees. So there's always going to be a middleman at some level. So right now, the way we make money is we sell B2B to these middlemen. Essentially, we are serving as almost a CRM for them to operate and do a better job with their business of managing referees. The long-term goal of this was always really to marketplace it, but ultimately we can really honestly accomplish a lot of our goals getting into this just using incremental approaches in technology, and eventually, maybe these assigners can do a lot better of a job just using technology at their fingertips. So that is kind of like a little overview on the industry. We have raised some money. We've done a couple different rounds where we actually put in, me and my partner both put in $12,500 to begin with. We put out that initial product. We had users, I think, for all of 3 hours before our product failed. We went $25,000 into the hole on our first project. We didn't develop for another 9 months as we just took a step back and really dove into market research and, trying to make sure we make the right decisions around development, it was our first mistake. And it was honestly a little scary and like just an eye-opening experience jumping into business. But yeah, we've raised about a little bit under $800,000 now to date. Some of that has come from myself and my partner actually investing ourselves. Some of it has come from non-diluted sources. We've won startup competitions like the Minnesota Cup. We've participated in the University of Colorado Boulder, which is where I went to school, startup competition. A couple other non-diluted funding sources. We've also raised about $120,000 to $50,000 through family and friends, and just closed our pre-seed round at $535,000, led by a local venture capital firm here, Groove Capital.
Very cool. And interesting on the middlemen and referees. Curious stats more around the industry, like how many referees, how many sports, or if you have any data around that.
Yeah.
I think that'd be fascinating because I'm sure there's a ton. I have no idea, but it's a big industry, right? Every game needs a ref or multiple.
Yeah. So realistically, we are really we're excluding professional and NCAA sports. We really work with amateur sports. So anything that's contractor based. So, an NHL referee, for example, doesn't necessarily fall under a thesis. However, the market size in which we think, just based on our just amateur sports alone, we're doing about 105 million amateur sports games a year here in the United States, which equates to us processing about $10 to $15 billion a year to referees. Now, of that 10 to 15 billion, about 20% of that is getting eaten by those middlemen. So let's say we move $11 billion this year to referees. About 2.5 of that is going to these assigners in the middle, and about 8.5 of it is going to the actual officials working the games. So across about 100 million sports games a year, we're spending about 10 to $15 billion on referees.
Interesting.
And those numbers do not reflect NCAA or professional sports in any way.
Yeah, and that's where on the market size. Do you have any idea how many refs there are in general, or are there organizations that are unions around refs in amateur sports, or like what's the structure to even become a ref?
Yeah, so that's like one of the biggest problems is just the barrier to entry is pretty extensive. There's millions of referees on an annual basis here in the United States. It does fluctuate every year. The reality is across 30 different sports here in the US, if you started reffing today, there's about a 40% chance you'll be doing it a year from now. And some of that retention rate can be attributed to parents and coaches being cruel to the 15-year-old trying to make an extra $50 on the weekend. But some of it, in my mind, really does stem from the fact that in this day and age, I could pick up my phone in a metropolitan area and I could drive DoorDash. I could drive people on Uber. I could walk someone's dog on Rover, even babysit on Care.com and pick my own hours and get paid by the end of the day. So there's certainly some barriers to entry when it comes to like getting trained. Getting your equipment is an upfront cost. That being said, different sports handle it different ways. So there isn't necessarily a referee union across the board, but there are organizations like NASA, which is the National Sports Officials Association, that do support officials in general. But every sport is a little bit different, and some are a lot more organized than others. For example, soccer has a national certification called the USSF, the U.S. Soccer Federation certification. Whereas baseball and basketball, it is kind of more of the Wild West, where you might get certified completely differently in one suburb compared to the suburb right next to you. So it's kind of a broad answer there because it's just sport specific and market specific, but that's the best I can do there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, the 40%, I had no idea that the turnover was that high, but it makes sense. And what's the typical payment for an amateur ref game, even if you have any data around specific sports?
So that also really varies based on sport and market. Like the same rate for here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, paying up to $85 for a 12U baseball game, which typically lasts about an hour and 20 minutes. Whereas I've met with these assigners all over the country. I met with someone a couple of days ago in Kentucky. They're paying $45 for the same level, same game. So it does definitely vary based on the market. What I've found is that soccer is probably the lowest paying, typically in like the $30 to $40 range per game. It also varies based on level too. But typically I've seen that soccer is the lower price point, whereas baseball, hockey, and a couple other sports are the higher price point. But again, it varies a lot based on market as well as the sport.
Yeah, that makes sense. And probably age or experience and the whole 9 yards. And if you're in baseball, if you're calling balls and strikes versus on the first baseline, yeah. So as you started to land clients, obviously you built the product, you went through some startup competitions, all that. How did you start to get this to market? How did you start to acquire these different customers and start driving revenue to the business?
I'd say fortunately for us and like the technology end, it's like a lot of the companies we're up against, they honestly look like government websites. Like it's archaic, they're clunky, there's too many features or not enough. And so the technology aspect isn't the hard part to beat. It's really getting our foot in the door. And there's a lot of politics when it comes down to youth sports, and you're dealing with a lot of like even our user, the typical demographic of these people we're selling, it's like 55 to 70-year-old white men that have been reffing soccer for 20 years. They know all the refs in the area, and then therefore they become that assigner. They do it for 10, 15 years, and then they pass it to the next person. So I would say one of our bigger barriers is just on the sales end with just, competing against statewide contracts that some of our competitors have. The fact that we have been developing for 3 years compared to our competitor who's been around for 28. So I would say on that note, it's been a learning curve, and just like trying to ultimately I'm selling something I'm super passionate about, and it's my thing, and they're my problems when they are problems. But at the end of the day, it is just A/B testing. Like I haven't been in sales for 15 years, but I am selling something I'm passionate about, and I probably know it better than anyone at this point. But it is, certainly something we struggle with. And beyond that, just, the fact that our team is all young and techie, and it's an archaic industry, and we're trying to push it towards, in that direction. There's certainly some ageism we experience. People don't take us as seriously. The reality is we're working, our butts off for the last 3 years trying to make this happen. So.
Yeah. And how do you combat that from a youth perspective? Because I've often found that it's sometimes if you can flip it the right way, it's actually more of an advantage, especially with trying to figure out Gen Z and where sports is going, and so you can start to flip that on its head too in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like dealing with our age is something that we've just had to get our heads around. I think some of it's probably on our end too, like maybe not feeling as confident going into a meeting or thinking that someone might be thinking of you differently. At the end of the day, I think actions speak louder than words, and the more I learn, the more I know, and the better I can pitch it. And I definitely am adjusting based on how people react in meetings or what my perception of how they're seeing it is. But it's that's not something I have a concrete answer for. It's just something. It is something that we're dealing with and trying to work around on a daily basis. I'm sure you deal with it as well.
Yeah, and something I always say is like put some gray hair around you. So I've done a good job of putting, some of my partners have no hair, but we just label it as gray hair. I know you have an advisory board and you have some other people on it. How have you gone about that process to, as I put it, put some gray hair around you, which really credentializes a lot of things that I've found at least too.
Yeah, I mean we've definitely been trying to do that. I think, and in my mind, I don't care as much about like having like the perception of us having that older person on our team. It's more so just surrounding ourselves with industry experts. One of the people that we've just recently gotten partnered with, who actually invested in our company as well as one of the founders of Sports Engine, which was a company that actually stemmed out of Minneapolis as well. Two younger guys, they started the company in their dorm room. And they're two people that myself and my partner have really been looking up to in this market for a while. In fact, I used their product as a little kid.
Oh,
So just trying to surround ourselves with people that have industry experience and also just, asking questions, trying to learn. We did the Techstars Accelerator program, which, we're the youngest people here. At the end of the day, I think you get out of it what you put into it. And, we were the ones like, yeah, if we're going to be the young guns that people might not take us seriously at the beginning, like we're going to beat them into the office every day and we're going to leave after them. And we're going to prove that we're working our asses off. Because at the end of the day, actions do speak louder than words.
100%. Yeah. Would you have Carson?
Yeah, Carson.
Yeah, he's good. From a future initiative, where do you see some other ways to build in? Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? As you start to capture more of this, your core base,
Yeah,
I'm sure you've uncovered some other opportunities or places to go.
yeah. One of the quotes I think I relate with relentlessly is strong convictions loosely held. So yeah, morally, like the reason we got into this was at some level to disintermediate that middleman. I think they're a big piece of the challenge of the industry. The reality is that here in Minneapolis, I was in one assigner group with one hockey pool. In Minnesota, it's obviously Minnesota hockey. It's a little bit different. There's 20 assigners within a 20-mile radius of me right now, and I probably qualify to work half of their games, except I don't have access to any of them because these assigners are small businesses, so they want to keep their list of referees close to home. So what happens is that if I talk to 100 sports organizations, 90 of them will tell me they're dealing with a referee shortage. Whereas if I talk to 100 referees, 90 of them will tell me they're actually looking for more work opportunities. So really trying to connect the dots there. And I think ultimately strong convictions loosely held is really important because, at the end of the day, if I just was stubborn and tried to do exactly what I set out to do, like our company probably wouldn't even be around right now. So ultimately it's about how can we, make the changes that we want to make and stay true to our morals, but also keep moving forward and not being, afraid to pivot and change. So I think the keys to the future of the industry for us is really one, training and certification, and two, standardization of levels and processes. So right now, it's one of the biggest barriers is just getting trained, having a consistent method across different states to be trained. So making it so that you could get on our app, you could get trained, you could take the in-person class, you could start working games that week. And then you work a game, you choose the game rather than getting plugged into it based on your own time, compensation that was offered, location, level that you qualify to work. You'd work that game, you could get paid in the parking lot. And, my goal with this was like, as a college kid, I could go, work a game on the weekend, get paid in the parking lot and go pick up a 6-pack of beer on the way home. So the reality is we're trying to, our initial approach and idea for the industry might be changing a little bit, but we're trying to make sure that we stay true to our morals and, ultimately actually doing a good and positive thing for the industry. So I think, standardizing a lot of the training, making it so that if I get trained in Minnesota and Wisconsin, it's not completely different. or God forbid, even just two neighboring suburbs of the same city.
Mm.
Taking it so that we can standardize levels, I think the way we get this to more of a marketplace style thing is when everyone categorizes their refs the exact same way, and we can use data to actually know how good a referee is. So once you can categorize refs into level 1, 2, 3, and 4, and these are the 12 data parameters that make you a level 1 before you qualify to take that level 2 class. At that point, you don't necessarily need to have a personal relationship with the referees anymore. You can just marketplace it and start posting games. So part of the big value of these assigners is they know there are 100 referees, and they know that 16-year-old little Jimmy might be a really good referee, and he's only been doing it for 2 years, whereas Bob, who's 55 and been doing it for 18, might actually be 80 pounds overweight and walking up and down the court and not doing a good job. So once we can actually use data to categorize referees in the right way, I think that there'll be a very large change in the outcome of the industry.
Yeah, I see both of those as opportunities, especially if I'm sure you're thinking about it as you can add in more machine learning or AI as well to connect dots and take that off the manual process.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought up the shortage of referees things, because I've always heard that, but it's never impacted anything. I've never seen it like, oh, there's no refs that show up to a game.
Yeah.
And so it's always been like, where's that coming from? And when you just, like you mentioned, I mean, what college kid won't go get paid $85 an hour
Yeah.
to do a game to
Yeah.
then, have a good weekend?
The reality is what we're really trying to do is like most of these assigners are small businesses, but we're trying to really push people in the direction of realizing like, look, if there's two suburbs that are right next to each other, usually it's gonna operate kind of like a Venn diagram, where 70% of this suburb's pool, they might work with one assigner, the other suburb might have another assigner, but chances are 30% of both their pools fall somewhere in the middle of that Venn diagram where they should be working for both of them. So trying to open it up, and our system almost has Facebook-like connection features that allow, it serves as a database. So officials can go in and they can filter by city, state, and sport and find all the other work opportunities in their area. Really, it's just trying to reallocate the supply that actually exists in markets rather than creating new referees. And then also focusing on kind of raising that retention rate past, if we can move the retention rate from 40 to 60%, like that'll astronomically increase the amount of officials in the country.
Yeah, that makes sense between the suburbs and stuff. Finishing on this, we ask everyone, I got a good perspective on the referee industry now, which is great. Appreciate it. Trends in sports, anything else you're paying attention to or you find interesting? Could be youth sports as a whole, could be completely unrelated to anything you're working on.
Yeah. Well, obvious trend I see is that across all sports, what like in just the entire industry of sports in general, I think that there is too much software. Like even just in the referee space, there's just too much software when it comes to the space that Sports Engine and Crossbar and Team Snap, and I could name 12 more, and like it's just oversaturated. And I think that in the next 10 years, like some big players are going to emerge and kind of monopolize it in the way that other industries have happened. I also on that in like the referee space, there's a couple trends that I see. One of which, and something that I've been paying a little bit of attention to, is just AI and how that's going to affect the industry. I genuinely, like, even if our company is very successful, I think in the next 10 years, we might even not be seeing as many actual referees. I know that they just tested in spring training for the MLB, they just tested kind of like getting rid of the umpires, where it was all run by cameras. Now, what I can see is that, for a sport like hockey, like I don't know if AI can break up a fist fight. But that being said, I do think the technology for not even having referees is already there. It's that people aren't necessarily ready for it. So I could see in 10 years, like our company getting, beat out by a company that just does AI referees. So you
Interesting.
don't even need a referee anymore. Instead of paying $85 for the 12U umpire, you might be able to buy a system that costs you $1,000 and then use it over the course of a 50-game season, and save an astronomical amount of money and remove the human error. So it's something that I am just like curious about moving forward is like, okay, when is this actually going to become a competitor of ours? And, when is the industry actually going to be ready for something like this? Because I personally think the technology is there already. It's just a matter of people being, ready for it.
Very interesting. So how do you combat that, or you just stay ahead of it? And
I think that's a good question. Like if it's a company that I've met with a couple of these AI companies that are working on something like this, and it's like they came out of the woodwork right now and had traction. Like we probably can't combat it, but I do think is if as we grow market share in the industry, like it's just a pivot we need to be aware of. Like okay, at some point, in the same way that Uber is not going to have drivers anymore because the cars are just going to drive themselves, like there might not be referees anymore. It's just going to be
yeah.
technology. So
Yeah, and I think that this stuff takes a lot longer than people think. So,
yeah,
I mean, if I had to really guess, it's probably closer to 50 years
yeah,
than
and you might be
10.
right. And there also might be some sports that embrace it and some sports that don't. But I especially in a sport like baseball where there's a lot of human error involved,
Hmm.
it's also part of the game and what people like. People don't mind the human error. It's like so. I think it's
Yeah,
more people side and like people being the market being ready for it compared to the technology, which isn't that in depth.
I agree. Interesting. Yeah, it's a great conversation. What's website, socials, where can people learn more?
Yeah, our website is our company is called Refr Sports, REFR Sports.com is our website. You can also look us up on LinkedIn. We've got a social media presence as well on TikTok, Instagram, all of which can just be searched and found at Refr Sports.